The ancient tower of Mawnan Church stands like a weathered sentinel above the Cornish coast, its medieval stones dark against storm clouds that roll in endlessly from the Atlantic. For centuries, this quiet corner of Cornwall knew only the rhythms of the sea, the whisper of wind through blackthorn and oak. But in April of 1976, two young girls came running from the woods near this very church, screaming about something they had seen among the trees. Something with glowing red eyes and the wings of a creature that should not exist. What flew over Cornwall that Easter weekend? More importantly, why does it keep coming back? This is not a story that fades comfortably into folklore. Mawnan became ground zero for one of Britain's most credible cryptid encounters, where witness after witness, children and teenagers and adults alike, described the same impossible thing. Terrified campers fled in the night. Skeptical investigators arrived with rational explanations and left as believers. And beneath it all lurks a darker possibility, one that reaches back through millions of years. What if something prehistoric never truly went extinct? What if it still circles these Cornish skies, waiting in the shadows of our oldest places, watching with eyes that burn like embers in the dark? Wayne. April weather in Cornwall has always possessed an unpredictable quality. One moment the sky stretches clear and promising above the ancient landscape, the next it darkens with the threat of rain rolling in from the Atlantic. It was during such changeable conditions on Easter Sunday, 1976, that two young girls took a walk that would fundamentally alter not just their own lives, but the entire mythology of the Cornish coast. Their names were June and Vicky Melling, and they were 9 and 12 years old, respectively. They had no interest in the paranormal that morning, no fascination with monsters or mysteries. They were simply two sisters on holiday, exploring the grounds near their family's vacation accommodation in the village of Mawnan Smith, doing what children have always done when freed from the routines of school and home. The path they chose wound through ancient woodland that clustered around Mawnan Old Church, a stone structure whose foundations reached back to Norman times, perhaps earlier. These were not the manicured forests of public parks, but genuine Cornish woods, thick with undergrowth, dense with the shadows cast by oak and ash trees that had stood for centuries. The ground was soft beneath their feet, still damp from recent rains. Moss covered the exposed roots that crossed the footpath like gnarled fingers. Everything smelled of wet earth and vegetation, that particular scent of growing things that becomes so pronounced in spring. The church itself stood as it had for nearly 900 years, surrounded by a graveyard where headstones tilted at odd angles, their inscriptions worn smooth by salt air and time. This was sacred ground, but sacred in that particularly Celtic way, where Christianity had been layered atop older beliefs, where the church had been built on a site that likely held significance long before any cross was raised. The tower rose above the tree line, square and solid, constructed from local stone that had weathered to a mottled gray. It was not a tall tower by cathedral standards, but it dominated that corner of the landscape, visible from the coastal path and from certain points along the Helford River estuary. The girls walked without any particular destination in mind. Their parents were back at the holiday cottage, likely preparing lunch or reading newspapers, enjoying that particular kind of relaxation that comes from being away from home. June and Vicky had been given permission to explore, with the usual parental warnings about staying together, not wandering too far, being back by a certain time. Standard instructions that every child receives and every child considers themselves too sensible to need. They approached the church from the woodland side, emerging from beneath the canopy of trees into the more open space of the churchyard. The change in light was sudden, as it always is when stepping from deep shade into daylight. They paused, allowing their eyes to adjust, and it was in that moment of stillness that they heard it. A rustling sound from above. Not the gentle movement of leaves in wind, but something more substantial. Something that suggested weight and mass. Both girls looked up simultaneously, their attention drawn to the church tower. At first, they saw nothing unusual, just the stone structure rising against the cloudy sky. Then the rustling came again, louder now, and accompanied by a sound that Vicky would later describe as being similar to fabric flapping heavily in a gust of wind. And then they saw it. What emerged from behind the tower, or perhaps from atop it, The girls could never be entirely certain, defied every category their young minds possessed for organizing the natural world. It was large, impossibly large. When it spread its appendages, whether they were wings or arms or something combining characteristics of both, the span seemed to equal the width of a grown man's height. The body was humanoid in its proportions, upright and substantial, covered in feathers or fur, or perhaps something between the two, grayish in color with mottling that made it difficult to focus on clearly. But it was the head that arrested their attention completely, that burned itself into their memories with such intensity that decades later they would still see it clearly when they closed their eyes. The head was owl-like, broad and flat-faced, but scaled to human proportions. Where an owl's head might be the size of a man's fist, this creature's head was as large as a human skull. Pointed tufts rose from the top, ears or horns or some mixture of both. The features suggested a beak, but also something more flexible, more expressive than any bird's face had right to be. And then there were the eyes. Red eyes that caught the filtered afternoon light and seemed to hold it, to glow with it. Not the dull red of reflected light bouncing off a nocturnal animal's retina, but a vivid arterial red that spoke of something alive and aware behind them. The creature was watching them, not glancing in their direction with the blank indifference of a wild animal, not observing them with the simple predatory calculation of a hawk spotting prey. It was watching them with intelligence, with interest, with what Vicky would later insist was curiosity. The moment stretched. Neither girl could afterward say with certainty how long they stood frozen in that churchyard, staring up at the thing that hovered near the tower. Vicky estimated perhaps 15 seconds. June thought it might have been a full minute. Time becomes elastic in moments of profound strangeness, either compressing to nothing or expanding until seconds feel like hours. The creature's wings, if they were wings, moved in a manner that defied the normal patterns of bird flight. There was no rapid beating, no visible effort. Instead, they seemed to undulate, to ripple, maintaining the thing's position in the air through some mechanism that neither girl understood. And all the while, those red eyes remained fixed on them, unblinking, assessing. Then June grabbed her sister's arm, breaking the spell, and both girls ran. They crashed back into the woods, branches catching at their clothes, roots threatening to trip them. Neither looked back until they had put considerable distance between themselves and the church. When they finally stopped, breathless and trembling, the tower was no longer visible through the trees. They argued briefly about what they had seen. Not whether they had seen something, that was beyond question, but what precisely it had been. June, being younger, was more willing to accept that it had been exactly what it appeared to be, something impossible, and therefore magical. Vicky, older and more aware of how adults responded to children's stories, was already trying to fit their experience into acceptable categories. A large bird, an owl distorted by distance and fear, something ordinary that had seemed strange because they had been startled. But even as she formulated these explanations, Vicky knew they were inadequate. She had seen owls before. She had seen herons and buzzards and all manner of large birds. What hovered near that church tower had been none of those things. When they returned to the cottage, their parents immediately noticed their agitation. The girls were flushed, breathing hard, visibly unsettled. Their father, Don Melling, asked what had happened. Had they been bothered by someone? Had they gotten lost? The girls exchanged a glance, a moment of silent communication between siblings deciding how much to reveal. Then Vicky began to describe what they had seen. She chose her words carefully, trying to sound rational. But as the description progressed, as she detailed the size, the hovering, the red eyes, she watched her father's expression shift from concern to skepticism. When she mentioned the claws, black and pincer-like, more like the grasping appendages of some enormous insect than the talons of a bird, she saw her father suppress a smile. When June added that it had been watching them, that it had known they were there and had been interested in them, their mother exchanged a look with their father that both girls recognized immediately. It was the look that said children have such vivid imaginations. The look that said, "Let's play along, but we know better." Their father suggested they had probably seen a large owl. Cornwall had several species of owl. Perhaps it had been closer than they realized, making it seem larger. The failing light could create odd effects. Shadows could be misleading. He was kind about it, not dismissive exactly, but clearly filing their story under childhood fancies, the sort of thing that would become a family anecdote. Remember that Easter when the girls thought they saw a monster? The psychological weight of not being believed settled on both children. They retreated into silence, answered their parents' follow-up questions with monosyllable. Yes, they were sure they were all right. No, they did not want to talk about it anymore. The rest of that evening passed in a subdued atmosphere. The girls went to bed early, both of them sleeping poorly. Both of them replaying that moment in their minds, seeing those red eyes watching them with undeniable intelligence. 2 days passed. April 17, 1976. The weather had cleared, and the family decided to take another walk in the area. Perhaps their parents thought that revisiting the location would help the girls see that there was nothing to fear, that daylight and familiarity would dispel whatever imaginings had frightened them. They approached the church again, this time as a family group, the parents leading, the girls trailing behind. And then, it happened again. The creature appeared, this time more clearly visible in the better light. It rose from behind the church tower, or perhaps it had been perched atop it and launched itself into the air. The description remained consistent. Man-sized, owl-headed, those distinctive pointed ear tufts, the impossible wings, the red eyes. But this time, there were witnesses beyond the two girls. This time, Don and Sally Melling saw it too. The family fled. They returned to the cottage immediately, packed their belongings with trembling hands, and left Cornwall that same day. Their vacation was cut short by 3 days. They drove back to their home in Lancaster, putting distance between themselves and whatever haunted the grounds of Mawnan Old Church. Don Melling, who had smiled indulgently at his daughter's story just 2 days earlier, would later contact Doc Shields, a local paranormal investigator. He wanted to report what they had seen. He wanted it documented. The man who had suggested his children had overactive imaginations now insisted on the reality of what they had witnessed. Something had been there. Something impossible. Something that watched them with intelligence burning in its red eyes. The Melling sisters' sighting became the foundation of what would later be called the Owlman of Mawnan. It established patterns that subsequent witnesses would confirm. The location, always near the church. The appearance, consistently described across different witnesses. The sense of intelligence, the feeling of being observed by something that understood what it was seeing. And perhaps most significantly, it established the profound effect such an encounter could have on ordinary people living ordinary lives. The Mellings had not been seeking mystery or publicity. They had simply taken a walk through Cornish woods on Easter Sunday, and that walk had changed them permanently. They had seen something that should not exist, and now they carried that knowledge with them, a burden that no amount of rationalization could fully dispel. The summer of 1976 brought more than just warm weather to the woods of Cornwall. It brought confirmation that whatever haunted the trees near Mawnan Old Church had not vanished into legend. The creature had returned, and this time it would reveal itself to witnesses who had never heard of the Melling sisters, witnesses who would independently describe the same impossible thing. Sally Chapman and Barbara Perry were typical teenagers that July, seeking adventure and freedom in the way that only 16-year-olds can. They decided to camp in the woods near Mawnan Church, drawn by the thick canopy of trees that promised seclusion and the thrill of spending a night outdoors without adult supervision. The spot they chose was dense with undergrowth, the kind of place where sunlight filters through leaves in scattered patches, where the boundary between the natural world and something older feels particularly thin. They pitched their tent in the late afternoon, laughing and chatting as they worked, completely unaware that they had chosen to sleep in a hunting ground. As dusk settled over the forest, the temperature dropped, and the girls retreated into their tent. The sounds of the woods, at night, are never quite silent. Branches creak, leaves rustle, nocturnal animals move through the undergrowth with cautious steps. Sally and Barbara lay in their sleeping bags, talking in whispers, letting the darkness envelop them. There's something about being in a tent at night that makes you acutely aware of how thin the fabric is between you and everything outside. Every sound becomes magnified. Every shadow against the tent wall becomes a potential threat. It was Barbara who saw it first. Not the shadow, not the silhouette, but the thing itself. She had stepped out of the tent to relieve herself, moving just a few feet into the trees, with her flashlight cutting a weak beam through the darkness. The beam caught something in the branches above, something that should not have been there. For a moment, her mind struggled to make sense of what her eyes were seeing. The shape was too large, too angular, too deliberately perched to be a natural part of the forest. Then it moved. The creature rose from its position on the ground behind a massive oak tree, unfolding itself in a way that defied every law of biology Barbara had ever learned in school. It stood, and as it did, it seemed to block out the sky itself. The sheer size of the thing was overwhelming, a presence that filled the space between earth and canopy with impossible mass. Barbara's scream tore through the night air, raw and primal, the kind of sound that comes from a place deeper than thought. Sally burst from the tent to find her friend frozen in place, flashlight trembling in her hand, the beam dancing wildly across the trees. When Sally turned to look where Barbara was staring, her own voice joined the chorus of terror. The Owlman stood before them, and in that moment both girls understood that they were seeing something that should not exist. The descriptions they would later give to investigators painted a picture of anatomical impossibility. The creature stood approximately 5 feet tall, its body covered in what appeared to be gray-brown feathers that caught the flashlight beam with an oily sheen. The torso was humanoid in proportion but distinctly avian in texture, as if someone had forced bird and human together in a nightmare amalgamation. The legs were perhaps the most disturbing feature, described by both girls as resembling crab legs more than anything that should support a bipedal creature. They were jointed in ways that seemed wrong, bending at angles that made the girls' eyes hurt to follow. These appendages ended in pincer-like claws that dug into the forest floor with each subtle shift of weight. But it was the eyes that truly paralyzed them with fear. Glowing red in the beam of the flashlight, they were large and round like an owl's, yet possessed of an intelligence that felt malevolent and ancient. The creature did not simply see them. It studied them. It watched them with the kind of focused attention that a predator gives to prey, calculating, measuring, deciding. The wings were massive, far larger than necessary for a creature of its size. When it spread them, they seemed to fill the entire clearing, stretching from tree to tree with a span that Barbara would later estimate at over 10 feet. The feathers rustled with a sound like dry leaves, a whisper that seemed to carry words neither girl wanted to understand. The creature did not flap these wings, did not attempt to fly. Instead, it used them almost like a display, a territorial warning that this space belonged to it, and the girls were trespassers. For what felt like hours but was likely only seconds, the three figures stood frozen in a tableau of horror. The girls clutching each other, the creature watching them with those burning eyes, the forest holding its breath around them. Then, with a movement too quick for something so large, the Owlman dropped to all fours and scrambled away through the undergrowth. The sound of its passage was unlike anything the girls had heard before, a combination of rustling feathers and clicking joints that faded into the distance toward Mawnan Church. Sally and Barbara did not wait. They abandoned their tent, their sleeping bags, their carefully packed supplies. They ran through the dark woods with a terror that gave them speed and sure-footedness even on the treacherous forest floor. They did not stop running until they reached the main road, where they flagged down a car and begged the startled driver to take them to safety. The local authorities were skeptical, as authorities always are when teenagers report monsters in the woods. But the girls' terror was genuine, their descriptions detailed and consistent. More importantly, when they were asked to draw what they had seen, both Sally and Barbara produced sketches that were remarkably similar to each other, and, more disturbingly, nearly identical to the descriptions given by the Melling sisters 3 months earlier. This is where the Owlman case takes a turn from simple folklore into something more substantive, something that demands closer examination. Sally Chapman and Barbara Perry had not heard of the Melling sisters' encounter. The earlier sighting had been reported to church officials and a few local investigators, but it had not made the news. There had been no published descriptions, no circulated drawings, no public discussions that the teenage girls could have encountered. Yet their account matched in every significant detail. The height, the feathers, the impossible crab-like legs, the glowing red eyes, the massive wingspan, even the location near Mawnan Old Church. 2 sets of witnesses, separated by 3 months and complete ignorance of each other's experiences, describing the same impossible creature. This was when Tony Shields became involved. a man known locally as Doc Shields, an investigator of strange phenomena and self-described wizard, who had built a reputation for documenting the unexplainable with a combination of theatrical flair and genuine investigative rigor. Shields understood that credibility in cryptozoology comes from documentation, from treating witnesses with respect, from gathering evidence before it disappears into rumor and distortion. He interviewed Sally and Barbara separately, recording their accounts in detail, noting the physical symptoms of their trauma. Both girls exhibited classic signs of genuine fear response: elevated heart rates, difficulty sleeping, and unwillingness to return to the area. These were not attention-seeking teenagers spinning tales for notoriety. These were young women who had seen something that fundamentally challenged their understanding of reality. Shields also made the crucial connection to the Melling sisters' earlier encounter. He brought the accounts together, compared the details, and began to see a pattern that suggested something more than random sightings. The creature was territorial. Every encounter happened within a half-mile radius of Mawnan Old Church. The ancient building, with its weathered stones and centuries of history, seemed to be the center of the Owlman's domain. Local historians noted that the church dated back to the Norman era, built on a site that likely held religious significance long before Christianity came to Cornwall. The area had been sacred to the Celts, possibly before that. There were old stories, fragments of folklore that spoke of guardians and watchers, of creatures that protected liminal spaces where the mundane world touched something older and stranger. The Owlman seemed to follow this pattern of a territorial guardian. It did not chase its witnesses far, did not follow them beyond the woods. It appeared, it watched, it displayed its presence as a warning, and then it retreated back into the shadows near the church. This behavior suggested intelligence, purpose, a role being fulfilled rather than random animal aggression. As summer deepened and word of the sightings began to spread through the local community, Mawnan Church and its surrounding woods took on a new character in the minds of residents. Parents warned their children away from the area. Campers chose different locations. The woods grew quiet, avoided, heavy with the weight of knowing that something impossible walked among the trees. The Owlman had returned, and it was watching, always watching, from the shadows of its ancient territory. The church stands where it has stood for more than 7 centuries, its gray stone walls rising from the Cornish earth like something grown rather than built. Mawnan Old Church, dedicated to St. Mawnan in the 13th century, occupies ground that was already ancient when Norman stonemasons first laid its foundations. The Christian builders knew what they were doing when they chose this spot. They always did. Throughout Britain, the pattern repeats itself with deliberate consistency. Churches erected on pagan sacred sites, Christian altars placed precisely where Celtic people once made offerings to older gods. The strategy was both practical and symbolic, a way of claiming spiritual territory by literally building over it, transforming the landscape of faith one foundation stone at a time. But something about Mawnan feels different. Locals will tell you this, though often reluctantly, their voices dropping low even in broad daylight. The church sits on a slope overlooking the Helford River, where mist rolls in from the sea and settles in the valleys like something with intention. Before Christianity reached these shores, the Celtic peoples recognized certain places as liminal spaces, thin places they called them, where the barrier between our world and the other world grew gossamer and permeable. Springs, groves, hilltops, and river bends. These were the locations where offerings were left, where druids performed rituals, where the veil could be pierced. The positioning of Mawnan Church aligns with what dowsers and ley line researchers identify as a significant convergence point. Ley lines, those theoretical alignments of ancient sites first popularized by Alfred Watkins in the 1920s, remain controversial among mainstream archaeologists. Yet the pattern is undeniable when you trace it on a map. Mawnan sits at a junction, connected to other sacred sites across Cornwall in lines that seem too precise to be coincidental. Stone circles, holy wells, and medieval churches linked together in geometric precision. Whether you believe these lines represent ancient trackways, spiritual energy pathways, or simply human pattern recognition, they mark Mawnan as significant, a nexus point in the landscape's hidden architecture. The churchyard itself harbors peculiarities that predate any recorded history. Ancient fig trees grow there, twisted and gnarled, their roots digging deep into the Cornish soil. Fig trees are not native to Britain. They require careful cultivation, preferring Mediterranean climates to the wind and salt of the Cornish coast. Yet these trees at Mawnan have stood for longer than anyone can remember, thriving where they have no right to exist. Locals whisper that they were never planted, that they simply appeared, or that they have stood since a time before memory, before the church, before even the Celtic people made this place sacred. The figs they produce are small and dark, and it's said that birds avoid them, leaving the fruit to wither on the branches or fall to the ground uneaten. Cornwall's folklore runs deeper and stranger than perhaps anywhere else in Britain. The county juts into the Atlantic like a finger pointing toward lost lands, toward Lyoness and the mythical realms said to lie beneath the waves. Its position at the edge of the world, the last land before endless ocean, has shaped its stories and its psyche. Here, the boundaries between real and unreal have always been negotiable. The Cornish language, a Celtic tongue related to Welsh and Breton, carried words for beings that standard English cannot quite capture. The doer, for instance, were demons or malevolent spirits, entities that existed in the shadows of Christian understanding, but belonged to older frameworks of belief. These doer were not the horned Christian devils of medieval theology. They were something more primal, beings of the land and sky, shapeshifters who could take animal form or appear as twisted mockeries of natural creature. Coastal communities, particularly those around estuaries and river mouths like the Helford, reported sightings of winged things for centuries before 1976. The accounts varied but shared common elements. Encounters during liminal times, at dawn or dusk, during fog or storms, moments when the world itself seemed uncertain. The creatures were described as neither bird nor beast, but something that borrowed characteristics from both while belonging fully to neither category. The tradition of shape-shifting runs through Celtic mythology like an underground river. Gods and heroes transformed themselves into animals, salmon, and eagles, and swans. Druids were said to possess the ability to change their forms, and certain families claimed descent from seal folk or other hybrid beings. The boundaries between human and animal, between flesh and spirit, remained fluid in these stories. So when people in 1976 reported seeing something impossible, something that looked like an owl but moved like a human, that had feathers but also appeared to have humanoid features, they were encountering a phenomenon that Cornish folklore had long anticipated. The year 1976 itself was a threshold year for Britain, a time of profound transition and crisis that created its own kind of thinness in the social fabric. The drought began in May and lasted through August, transforming the landscape into something unfamiliar and unsettling. Reservoirs dried to reveal long-submerged villages and forgotten foundations. The earth cracked open in fields that had been green for generations. Water rationing was enforced, standpipes appeared on streets, and the very substance of life became scarce and precious. Britain, an island nation defined by rain and mist, found itself sun-scorched and desperate. The economic crisis compounded the environmental disaster. Inflation spiraled beyond control, unemployment climbed, and the social contract between government and citizens frayed toward breaking. The optimism of the 60s had curdled into the harsh realities of the 70s. The International Monetary Fund was approached for a loan, a humiliation for a nation that had so recently presided over a global empire. Strikes disrupted essential services, and there was a pervasive sense that the old order was collapsing without any clear vision of what might replace it. In such times, perhaps we become more sensitized to the anomalous, more likely to notice the things that don't fit into our frameworks of understanding. Or perhaps, as some traditions suggest, reality itself becomes unstable during periods of collective stress and transformation. The barriers thin not just in certain places but during certain times, during moments of crisis when the usual certainties fail, and the world reveals itself as stranger and more uncertain than we allow ourselves to believe. Children saw the thing at Mawnan first, and this detail carries its own significance in folklore and psychology alike. Children, not yet fully trained in what is and isn't possible, remain open to experiences that adults have learned to filter out or reinterpret. The young girls who reported the creature near the church in April of 1976 were not the last. More sightings followed through that summer of drought and social upheaval, concentrated around the church and its ancient grounds. The descriptions that emerged shared disturbing consistencies. The creature was as large as a man or larger, with enormous wings and penetrating red eyes. It appeared gray or brown, with feathered or rough skin. It had clawed feet, and some witnesses described it as having a mouth or beak that seemed to express malevolence. It was seen perched in trees, particularly in the strange fig trees of the churchyard. It was spotted hovering near the church tower, and at least once, it reportedly chased witnesses who had ventured too close to its territory. These accounts echo reports from other thin places around the world. Point Pleasant, West Virginia had its Mothman in 1966 and 67, another winged humanoid appearing during a time and in a location marked by industrial decline and environmental degradation. Other cultures report similar beings: the Thunderbirds of Native American tradition, the Tango of Japanese folklore, the Strigoi of Romanian legend. The details vary, but the archetype remains constant. Something that flies, something that watches, something that appears at boundaries and thresholds. Mawnan Church, with its layered history and its position at the confluence of earth energies and ancient worship, seems purpose-built to host such phenomena. The Christian structure erected on pagan ground, the impossible fig trees, the lie-line convergence, and the proximity to water all mark it as a location where normal rules might not fully apply. Add to this the psychological and social turbulence of 1976, and you have conditions that folklorists and paranormal researchers recognize as conducive to high strangeness. Whether the Owlman of Mawnan was a flesh-and-blood creature, a psychological manifestation given form by collective belief, or something else entirely, something that exists in the spaces between categories, remains unresolved. What we can say with certainty is that the location itself has always been recognized as special, as dangerous, as a place where the impossible might suddenly become visible. The ancient peoples who made it sacred, the medieval builders who claimed it for Christianity, and the modern witnesses who encountered something inexplicable, they are all responding to the same essential quality of that ground. Some places carry a charge, a potency that persists across centuries and changing belief systems. Mawnan Old Church is undeniably one of them, marked by its trees and its position, by its history and its ongoing reputation as somewhere the veil grows thin, and what waits on the other side occasionally peers through. The summer of 1976 brought with it more than just the scorching heat that baked Cornwall's ancient stones. As the holiday season drew families to Mawnan's peaceful shores, something else was waiting in the woods surrounding the church. Something that would transform a sleepy coastal village into the epicenter of a terror that spread like wildfire through the peninsula. Jane Greenwood was 14 that July, a girl who loved nothing more than capturing the world around her in pencil and charcoal. She had come to Cornwall with her family, seeking the same respite from city life that countless other holidaymakers craved each summer. On the morning of July 3rd, she settled herself on the stone wall bordering St. Mawnan's churchyard, her sketchpad balanced on her knees, determined to capture the way the ancient tower rose against the brilliant blue sky. The morning had started peacefully enough. Birds sang in the surrounding oaks and beeches. The air carried the salt-sweet smell of the sea, mixing with wildflowers blooming in the churchyard. Jane's pencil moved across the paper with practiced strokes, shading in the weathered stones, the Gothic windows, the way ivy climbed the southern wall. She was lost in the work, in that meditative state artists know so well, when the first sensation crept over her like cold water down her spine. Someone was watching her. Jane looked up from her sketch, scanning the churchyard. Empty. Just ancient headstones leaning at odd angles, some so old their inscriptions had been worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. She turned, looking behind her toward the woods. Nothing moved. Yet the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing moment. Not the awkward awareness of a curious stranger's gaze, but something far more primal. The sensation of being studied by something that was deciding, calculating, measuring her as prey. Her hands had begun to shake. She told investigators later that she had never experienced fear quite like it, not from a film or a nightmare. This was her body responding to something her conscious mind had not yet registered, ancient instincts screaming warnings that modern sensibilities tried to ignore. She gripped her pencil tighter and forced herself to look up, to scan the tree line systematically, to prove to herself that her imagination was simply running wild. That's when she saw it. Perched in the old oak tree that overlooked the churchyard wall, perhaps 30 feet above the ground, something impossibly large clung to a thick branch. At first, her mind refused to process what her eyes were showing her. The shape was wrong, all wrong. Too large for an owl, too angular for any bird she had ever seen. It stood nearly as tall as a grown man, balanced on legs that bent backward like a bird's, but far too thick, too powerful. Jane's sketchpad slipped from her lap and clattered against the stone wall. The creature's head swiveled toward the sound, and she found herself staring into eyes that glowed a fierce red even in the bright morning sunlight. Eyes that held an intelligence that made her stomach turn. This was no simple animal acting on instinct. Whatever perched in that tree was aware, conscious, studying her with a focus that suggested thought and intention. The creature spread its wings. Jane would remember that moment for the rest of her life with perfect, terrible clarity. The wingspan was massive, far wider than should have been possible. The membrane stretched between the wing bones appeared leathery rather than feathered, though patches of dark plumage covered parts of its body. As the wings extended fully, they blotted out the sun, casting Jane in shadow. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant. She tried to scream but found her voice had abandoned her. Her legs refused to move. Every muscle in her body had locked, trapping her in place while her heart hammered against her ribs. The creature maintained its position, wings spread wide in what Jane interpreted as a threat display, showing her exactly what she was dealing with, exactly how outmatched she was. The message was clear and primal. Here was a predator, and she was prey, and the only thing standing between her and those talons was the creature's own choice. Later, when investigators asked how long she remained frozen there, Jane couldn't say. It might have been 30 seconds. It might have been 5 minutes. Time had stopped having meaning. But eventually, the creature folded its wings with a sound like canvas snapping in the wind, turned its head away, and launched itself from the branch. For one heart-stopping moment, Jane thought it was diving toward her. Instead, it banked hard to the right and disappeared deeper into the woods, moving with a speed and agility that seemed to defy its size. Only when it vanished completely did Jane find she could move again. She ran, leaving her sketchpad and pencils scattered across the churchyard wall, not stopping until she reached the cottage where her family was staying, nearly a mile away. But Jane Greenwood's encounter was just the beginning. 2 weeks later, on July 17th, two sisters from Plymouth, 14-year-old Sally Chapman and her younger sister Barbara, were playing in the woods near the church when they heard movement in the canopy above them. Looking up, they saw the same creature Jane had described, watching them from a high branch. Both girls reported the same overwhelming fear, the same sense of being in the presence of something that viewed them as potential prey. They fled, hand in hand, crashing through the undergrowth in their panic. What made their account particularly compelling to investigators was that neither girl had heard about Jane Greenwood's sighting. The family had just arrived in Mawnan that morning, and the local papers had not yet picked up the story. Yet their description matched Jane's with eerie precision. The backward bending legs, the red eyes that seemed to glow with their own light, the massive wingspan, the feeling of paralyzing dread that came with the creature's attention. Sally Chapman added one detail that would become particularly significant. She claimed the creature had pointed ears that rose to distinct tufts, giving it an owl-like appearance despite its otherwise wrong proportions. She also noted the feet, describing talons that looked powerful enough to crush bone, each toe ending in a black claw, the length of a steak knife. By late July, the story had broken beyond the confines of Mawnan village. The Western Morning News ran the first article, treating the accounts with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism, but giving the witnesses space to tell their story. Other regional papers followed. By August, the national press had descended on the quiet Cornish village, bringing camera crews and reporters who interviewed anyone willing to talk. The media attention brought predictable results. Skeptics emerged, offering explanations ranging from misidentified herons to mass hysteria among suggestible children. One ornithologist proposed that witnesses had seen a particularly large barn owl, and in their fear and excitement, had exaggerated its size and features. But this explanation satisfied no one who had actually spoken with the witnesses. The girls were consistent, specific, and genuinely traumatized. Whatever they had seen, it was not a barn owl. Simultaneously, the media circus attracted investigators from various backgrounds. Tony Shields, a local artist and self-described wizard, took a particular interest in the case. Paranormal researchers arrived with cameras and recording equipment. Cryptozoologists came hoping to document evidence of an unknown species. The woods around St. Mawnan became a hub of activity, with everyone from serious researchers to curious tourists tramping through the undergrowth, hoping for their own glimpse of the creature that had become known as the Owlman. The impact on the local community was profound and immediate. Mawnan had always been a quiet place, the kind of village where people knew their neighbors and strangers stood out. Suddenly, that peace had been shattered. Parents who had once let their children roam freely now kept them close. The woods that had been a playground became forbidden territory after dark. Local residents reported a shift in the atmosphere around the church. The bird song that had always filled the trees seemed muted. Dogs refused to enter certain areas of the woods, straining at their leashes and whining. Even hardened skeptics in the village admitted that something felt different, though they attributed it to the power of suggestion and the constant stream of outsiders disturbing the natural rhythm of the place. The Owlman sightings of 1976 represented more than just a series of strange encounters. They revealed something fundamental about how communities respond to the unknown, how fear spreads and transforms, how the invasion of the inexplicable can reshape the psychological landscape of an entire region. The young witnesses carried their terror with them, a burden that would influence their relationship with the natural world for years to come. And Mawnan itself was forever changed, marked on the map, not just as a picturesque Cornish village, but as the place where something impossible had made itself known, where the boundary between the ordinary and the extraordinary had become frighteningly thin. After the summer of 1976, something peculiar happened. The Owlman simply vanished. The church grounds at Mawnan Old Church fell silent. Where there had been panic, witness accounts, and fevered speculation, now there was only the whisper of coastal wind through the trees and the distant crash of waves against Cornish rock. No more sightings. No more children running terrified from the woods. No more dark shapes hovering above ancient tombstones. It was as if the creature had never existed at all, as if the whole affair had been nothing more than collective hysteria that burned bright and intense before fading into local legend. But those who had seen it knew better. They carried something with them, something that wouldn't fade with time or rational explanation. For years, researchers and curiosity seekers would occasionally venture to the church, hoping for a glimpse of the legendary creature. They left disappointed. The Owlman had retreated into whatever darkness had spawned it, leaving behind only newspaper clippings and the haunted memories of witnesses who found themselves increasingly doubted as the years rolled by. June Melling and her sister, now growing into young women, held firm to their account despite the skepticism. Sally Chapman, who had seen the creature perched in broad daylight, never wavered in her insistence that what she encountered was real, was physical, was utterly beyond normal explanation. But without new sightings to corroborate their experiences, even the most dedicated believers began to wonder if the Owlman had been a brief anomaly, a temporary tear in the fabric of the ordinary world that had since healed over. Then came 1989, 13 years after the original sightings. A young woman and her boyfriend visiting Cornwall from London were walking near the church on a summer evening when they witnessed something that stopped them cold. A massive figure, they reported, with wings that seemed too large for any bird, perched in a tree near the church wall. The same location, the same description. The creature they saw matched the accounts from over a decade earlier, accounts they insisted they had never heard, had no knowledge of when they made their report to local authorities. The boyfriend, a skeptic by nature, later told investigators that he wished he could explain what they saw as a large owl or a trick of the fading light. But he couldn't. What they witnessed was far too large, far too structured, far too deliberately positioned to be any known bird. It had turned its head to look at them, he said, and in that moment of eye contact, he felt certain that whatever this thing was, it possessed an intelligence that was watching, evaluating, considering them with an awareness that felt almost malevolent. This single sighting reignited interest in the Owlman phenomenon. Researchers who had filed the 1976 cases away as interesting but dormant suddenly had new material to examine. The pattern of the report was striking. Same location, same general description, same sense of dread reported by witnesses, but 13 years apart. What kind of creature operates on such a timeline? What explains such a lengthy absence followed by such a precise return? These were not migrating birds following seasonal patterns. No known owl species vanishes for over a decade, only to reappear in exactly the same location. The cyclical nature of the appearances suggested something far stranger was at work. The 1990s brought more sightings, each separated by years, but linked by uncanny similarity. In 1995, an American tourist named Gavin, visiting Cornwall with no particular interest in local legends, had an experience that would shake his empirical worldview to its foundation. He had been exploring the coastal paths near Mawnan Smith, drawn to the picturesque old church he had spotted from a distance. The afternoon was clear, the kind of perfect Cornish day that appears on postcards. He was taking photographs of the church grounds when movement caught his eye. Something large lifted from the trees behind the church tower. At first, his mind tried to categorize it as a bird, perhaps a heron taking flight. But as it rose higher, silhouetted against the bright sky, he realized with growing horror that what he was seeing was structured like nothing in nature. The wings were massive, yes, but they had a leathery quality, a bat-like configuration that no British bird possesses. And the body, suspended between those vast wings, was too humanoid in its proportions. It had risen vertically, he later reported, without the running start that large birds need for takeoff. Just a sudden explosive launch upward, as if gravity held less sway over it than it should. Gavin snapped several photographs, his hands shaking, but when developed, they showed only blurred shapes, dark smudges against bright sky. Classic evidence problems that plague so many cryptid encounters. But his testimony remained consistent, detailed, and deeply unsettling. He described the creature's head as disproportionately large, with what appeared to be pointed ear tufts or horns that gave it the distinctive owl-like silhouette. When he returned to the United States, he began researching the area, trying to understand what he had seen. Only then did he discover the older Owlman accounts. The realization that he had independently witnessed and described the same entity seen by others decades earlier, in the exact same location, left him convinced that something genuinely anomalous existed in those woods. In 1996, another encounter was reported to paranormal researchers investigating the ongoing mystery. A couple walking through the churchyard at dusk saw what they initially mistook for a person in dark clothing, standing among the gravestones. But as they drew closer, the figure revealed itself to be something altogether different. It was taller than a man, they reported, with enormous folded wings pressed against its body. The face, briefly visible in the fading light, was flat and broad, with large dark eyes that seemed to reflect the last rays of sunlight with an unnatural gleam. Before they could approach further or call out, the creature unfurled its wings and lifted into the air with a sound one witness described as like heavy canvas napping in wind. It cleared the church tower and disappeared into the darkening woods beyond. The couple, badly shaken, reported their sighting to local police, who directed them to researchers who had been documenting the phenomenon. Like others before them, they had no prior knowledge of the Owlman legend. They were simply two people who saw something impossible and had the courage or compulsion to report it. This pattern of cyclical appearance, of years-long dormancy broken by sudden returns, presents one of the most puzzling aspects of the Owlman mystery. Traditional explanations begin to crumble under the weight of this temporal strangeness. If this were a misidentified bird, there would be consistent sightings throughout the years. Birds do not appear for a summer, vanish for 13 years, then return for isolated encounters spread across the following decade. If this were a hoax, the perpetrators would have needed to maintain their deception across decades, coordinating sightings by independent witnesses who had no connection to each other and no apparent knowledge of the legend they were perpetuating. The logistics alone strain credulity. Some researchers have proposed that the Owlman represents a creature that exists on the edges of our reality, slipping in and out of visibility according to laws we do not yet understand. This theory, while seemingly fantastic, attempts to explain why physical evidence remains so elusive while witness testimony remains so consistent. Perhaps, they suggest, the Owlman exists in a state that is only occasionally solid enough to be perceived by human senses. Perhaps it moves through time differently than we do, appearing to us at intervals that seem random but follow a pattern we simply cannot perceive from our limited vantage point. These ideas push against the boundaries of accepted science, but then again, so does the existence of a 7-foot-tall winged humanoid haunting an English churchyard. Others have wondered if the location itself holds significance. Mawnan Old Church sits on land that has been considered sacred or significant for far longer than Christianity has existed in Cornwall. Ancient peoples recognized power in certain places, built their monuments, and conducted their rituals where earth energies or ley lines were said to converge. Could the church, built over such a site, serve as a kind of doorway or weak point in whatever barrier separates our world from others? This would explain why the creature returns specifically to this location, why it manifests here and nowhere else, why it appears and disappears according to its own inscrutable schedule rather than following biological imperatives we recognize. As the witnesses from 1976 grew into adults, some have spoken publicly about how their childhood encounters shaped their lives. June Melling, now a grown woman with children of her own, has never recanted her account. In interviews, she speaks with the calm certainty of someone who knows what she experienced, regardless of whether others believe her. She describes how the sighting gave her a permanent awareness that the world contains mysteries that resist explanation, that reality is stranger and more complex than the safe, ordered universe we're taught to believe in. Sally Chapman, similarly, has maintained her story into adulthood with unwavering consistency. The details she recalls, the emotional impact still evident in her voice when she describes the creature's red eyes and glowing appearance, these are not the markers of false memory or childhood imagination. These are the testimonies of people who encountered something that violated their understanding of what was possible, and who have spent their lives carrying that knowledge. The Owlman, it seems, operates on its own timeline, guided by motivations that remain utterly opaque to human understanding. It appears when it chooses, not when we expect or hope for it. It shows itself to some and not others, even among people standing in the same location at the same time. Some witnesses report feeling watched for days before their encounter, as if the creature selects who will see it, who will carry the burden of that impossible vision. This selectivity suggests an intelligence behind the appearances, a purpose we cannot begin to fathom because we lack the framework to even ask the right questions. What do we make of a phenomenon that refuses to conform to our expectations of how reality should behave? The Owlman will not be caught, will not be photographed clearly, will not appear on demand for investigators with equipment and credentials. Yet it also will not fade into complete obscurity. Just when the sightings seem to have stopped forever, when the legend appears ready to fossilize into quaint local folklore, the creature returns. Another witness, another impossible encounter, another thread connecting present to past, proving that whatever this thing is, it has not finished with Mawnan Old Church. It has not finished with us. The years of silence between sightings do not diminish the mystery. If anything, they deepen it. They suggest that we are not dealing with a simple unknown animal, but with something that exists according to rules we have not yet discovered, operating with purpose we cannot comprehend, appearing and vanishing in patterns that might be meaningful if only we could decode them. The Owlman keeps its own time, follows its own seasons, and the watchers who visit that ancient church hoping for a glimpse can only wait and wonder when, not if, it will return again. The courtroom of public opinion has its own rules of evidence, and in the case of the Cornish Owlman sightings, one name appears repeatedly in the prosecution's case against the phenomenon: Tony Shields, stage magician, performance artist, self-proclaimed wizard of the Western world. A man whose very presence in this story has given skeptics everything they need to dismiss the entire affair as theatrical smoke and mirrors. To understand why Shields became the lightning rod for controversy, you need to understand who he was. Born in 1938, Shields had built a career on the margins of entertainment and the occult, a showman who blurred the lines between illusion and belief with deliberate mischief. He performed stage magic under the name Dr. Shields, cultivating an image of mystical authority, complete with flowing robes and theatrical pronouncements. By the 1970s, he had reinvented himself as a psychic detective, a monster hunter, someone who could allegedly summon creatures from the depths through ritual and will. And in 1976, just as the Owlman sightings were beginning to accumulate, there was Tony Shields, right in the middle of it all, conducting what he called magical experiments in Mawnan Woods. The skeptical case writes itself. Here was a professional trickster with documented skills in deception, a man who had every motive to fabricate a sensation. Shields actively courted media attention, contacting newspapers, giving interviews, positioning himself as the expert investigator of this emerging mystery. He claimed to have performed rituals to manifest the creature, essentially taking credit for its appearance. What better way for a fading performer to reclaim relevance than to create a monster, and then present himself as the only one who understood it? Critics point to his theatrical background as damning evidence. Shields knew how illusions work. He understood crowd psychology, the power of suggestion, how to plant ideas that would blossom into reported sightings. Stage magicians are masters of misdirection, of creating experiences that witnesses will swear were real even when confronted with proof of deception. Could the entire Owlman phenomenon be nothing more than Shields' greatest trick, a performance played out across months and years with the whole of Mawnan as his stage? The inconsistencies in various accounts seem to support this theory. Some witnesses described a creature with pointed ears, others with rounded. The size varied from report to report. The color shifted from silver gray to brown to dark shadowy mass. These variations, skeptics argue, are exactly what you would expect from a fabricated phenomenon, where different people were either imagining things based on suggestion or potentially even working with Shields to create false reports. Then there is the convenient timing of media coverage. Newspapers picked up the story with remarkable speed. The Western Morning News, the Daily Mirror, local publications all ran features about the mysterious creature of Mawnan. And who was quoted in many of these articles? Tony Shields, always ready with a colorful quote, always willing to speculate about the creature's origins and nature. For skeptics, this media synchronicity suggested coordination, a planned publicity stunt that worked exactly as designed. The hoax theory gained further weight from Shields' own admissions. In later years, he would speak cryptically about his involvement, sometimes claiming he had summoned the Owlman through magic, other times hinting that the whole affair had been a kind of performance art, a test of how easily people could be convinced to see the impossible. He seemed to enjoy the ambiguity, never quite confirming or denying whether he had orchestrated the sightings. For a man who thrived on mystery and attention, what could be more perfect than a legend he could neither take full credit for nor be definitively blamed for creating? So, there it is. The skeptical case, neat and complete. A stage magician with motive and means, inconsistent witness reports, convenient media timing, and the suspect's own playful admissions of involvement. Case closed. File it under hoax and move on. Except the evidence does not actually support that conclusion. Not when you examine it closely. Not when you strip away assumptions and look at the timeline, the witnesses, the persistence of the phenomenon. The hoax theory, so compelling on the surface, begins to crumble under scrutiny. Let us start with the most critical fact that skeptics routinely ignore or minimize. The Melling family sighting occurred in April of 1976. Don Melling, his wife, and their 2 daughters saw the creature near the church tower on Easter Saturday. This was before Tony Shields became involved, before any media coverage, before there was any reason for anyone in Mawnan to fabricate a monster sighting. The Mellings were on holiday, visitors with no connection to the area, no knowledge of local legends, no awareness that they were about to become part of something larger. Their daughters, June and Vicky, described the creature in specific detail: the feathered body, the glowing red eyes, the sensation of overwhelming wrongness that made them flee in terror. They drew pictures independently that matched each other. They told their story to their parents with the kind of genuine fear that cannot be easily faked, especially not by children who had nothing to gain from lying. Don Melling reported the sighting to a local paranormal investigator, not to the newspapers, not to Tony Shields, who was not yet part of the narrative. The Mellings simply wanted to tell someone what they had seen and then leave Mawnan behind. Shields only became involved later, after other sightings began to emerge, after word spread through local networks that something strange was happening in the woods. He inserted himself into an existing phenomenon, not created one from nothing. This sequence of events is crucial and documented. The Owlman existed as a reported entity before Shields arrived to claim expertise about it. Then there are the Campbell sisters, Sally and Barbara, aged 14 and 9 respectively, who had their encounter in July of 1976. They were camping with their family near the church, completely unaware of the Melling sighting months earlier. Different family, different time, no contact with the previous witnesses. Yet when they described what they saw hovering above the church tower, the details aligned with terrifying precision. Large wings, red eyes, a humanoid shape covered in gray feathers. The same proportions, the same unsettling presence. These girls were questioned separately by local vicar Donald Spooner, a man with no investment in monster stories, someone who approached their account with appropriate skepticism. He found them credible. He noted their genuine distress, the way their descriptions matched without coordination. He documented their drawings, which bore striking similarities to what the Melling daughters had sketched. Spooner was not a believer in the paranormal, but he was convinced that these children had experienced something that frightened them deeply. In the years that followed, sightings continued. 1978 brought new reports. 1989 saw another cluster of encounters. These occurred long after the initial media frenzy had died down, long after Tony Shields had moved on to other projects and controversies. The newspapers were no longer interested. There was no publicity to be gained. Yet, people still reported seeing something impossible in Mawnan Woods, describing the same creature with the same disturbing characteristics. If this was a hoax orchestrated by Shields, why did it persist without him? Why did witnesses continue to come forward when there was no attention, no reward, only the social cost of being dismissed as delusional or attention-seeking? Hoaxes collapse when the hoaxer loses interest or gets exposed. The Owlman phenomenon did not collapse. It simply continued, quieter but consistent, a steady trickle of reports that never quite stopped. The consistency across independent witnesses is what ultimately destroys the hoax theory. Children from different families who never met each other describe the same creature. Not vaguely similar creatures, but entities with matching specific details. The red glowing eyes appear in nearly every account. The feathered or downy covering. The wing structure that seems wrong, not quite bird-like, something in between. The proportions that suggest human size and stance but with avian features. This level of consistency is nearly impossible to achieve in a fabricated phenomenon. When people make up stories or misidentify known animals, the descriptions vary wildly based on individual imagination and expectation. But the Owlman reports align on key features despite coming from witnesses who had no contact with each other, no opportunity to coordinate their stories, no shared cultural reference for what they were seeing. Researchers who have interviewed the witnesses decades later describe people still marked by their experiences. These are not individuals enjoying notoriety or spinning tales for entertainment. Many speak reluctantly, still uncomfortable with what they saw, still unable to explain it in terms that make rational sense. June Melling, tracked down years after her childhood encounter, spoke of nightmares that lasted months, a lingering unease in wooded areas, the absolute certainty that what she saw was real and unknown. A man named Jonathan Downs, a cryptozoologist who has investigated the case extensively, spent years speaking with witnesses and locals. He described sitting across from people who had seen the Owlman and recognizing genuine trauma in their voices. The way their hands would shake slightly when recalling specific details, the discomfort in their eyes when pressed about whether they were certain of what they saw. These were not performances. These were people trying to communicate an experience that defied their understanding of reality. The lingering trauma is perhaps the most compelling evidence against fabrication. Children can be convinced to lie for short periods, but they cannot sustain elaborate deceptions that cause them genuine psychological distress for years. Adults might invent stories, but they do not typically volunteer for the social consequences that come with claiming to have seen something impossible. The witnesses in the Owlman case gained nothing from their reports except skepticism, mockery, and the burden of an unexplained experience. Tony Shields may have been a trickster, but he was not capable of orchestrating what actually happened at Mawnan. He could not have coordinated independent families visiting the area months apart. He could not have implanted identical detailed memories in children who never met. He could not have sustained a phenomenon for decades after his involvement ended. The scope of conspiracy required for the hoax theory to work exceeds any reasonable capability of a single-stage magician looking for publicity. And so we are left with something more unsettling than a simple hoax. We are left with witnesses we cannot easily dismiss, consistency we cannot explain away, a phenomenon that resists the comfortable conclusion that it was all just tricks and lies. The skeptical case collapses under the weight of what it cannot account for, leaving us in the uncomfortable space where something unknown becomes harder to deny than to accept. The Owlman of Mawnan remains unexplained, not because we lack imagination to debunk it, but because the evidence refuses to cooperate with our preferred narratives of deception. And that is more terrifying than any fabricated monster could ever be, because it suggests that reality contains spaces where our certainties do not reach, where children can encounter something that should not exist and carry the scars of that encounter for the rest of their lives. The hoax theory is insufficient. The witnesses are credible. The phenomenon persists. And we are left with the deeply uncomfortable possibility that something truly unknown walked the woods of Mawnan, was seen by people who had no reason to lie, and remains unexplained despite our desperate attempts to rationalize it away. The path through Mawnan Woods looks different in daylight, but the shadows remain the same. Today, visitors walk these trails with cameras and smartphones, seeking that perfect photograph of Cornwall's coastal beauty, unaware that they're treading the exact ground where children once ran in absolute terror. The ancient yew trees still arch overhead, their twisted branches forming a canopy that filters the sunlight into dancing patterns on the forest floor. And somewhere in that interplay of light and shadow, the memory of something impossible still lingered. Mawnan Old Church stands as it has for centuries, its Norman tower rising above the woodland like a sentinel keeping watch over both the living and the dead. The stone walls have weathered countless storms rolling in from the Atlantic, and the graveyard surrounding it holds generations of Cornish families, their headstones slowly succumbing to moss and lichen. But there's something else this place holds, something that can't be measured in stone or recorded in parish records. This location carries the weight of encounters that defy every rational explanation, testimonies from credible witnesses across multiple decades who all describe seeing something that shouldn't exist. Walk the perimeter of the church today, and you'll find everything ordinary. Parents bring children to play among the gravestones while they admire the medieval architecture. Tourists snap photographs of the view across the Helford River. Dog walkers traverse the woodland paths, enjoying the peaceful isolation. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy lies an uncomfortable truth that researchers and investigators cannot dismiss. Too many people, separated by too many years, have reported the same impossible thing. They've described an entity that violates the known laws of biology, a creature that appears and vanishes without leaving behind the physical evidence that every living thing should produce. The witnesses weren't unreliable. They weren't seeking attention or fame. The Melling sisters were ordinary children on a camping holiday in 1976, drawing pictures of birds they'd seen. Sally Chapman and Barbara Perry were teenagers enjoying the woods in 1977, right up until the moment something rose before them on legs too powerful, too wrong. June Melling, the mother, saw it herself and reported it to authorities, staking her family's credibility on the truth of something that couldn't be real. The uniformed man in 2007, someone trained in observation and protocol, fled from something in these woods despite his professional composure. Each account describes anatomical impossibilities. Wings spanning 15 feet or more, attached to a humanoid frame that shouldn't be able to support such appendages. Eyes that glow with their own terrible light, red like burning coals in a furnace of malevolence. Legs that bend wrong, that propel it upward in defiance of how muscle and bone should articulate. Talons that seem designed for grasping, for holding, for purposes better left unimagined. This isn't a creature that fits into any known taxonomy. It's not an owl mistaken for something else. Because owls don't perch like gargoyles on church towers, don't maintain eye contact with witnesses, don't inspire the kind of primal terror that leaves psychological scars lasting decades. The question that haunts every serious researcher is simple yet profound. If the Owlman is real, then what exactly is it? The theories multiply like shadows at dusk, each attempting to explain the unexplainable. Could it be a prehistoric survivor, some species that managed to persist in isolation, hidden from scientific discovery? The world still yields new species regularly, though admittedly none that approach this size or strangeness. Cornwall's coastline holds caves and isolated pockets that might theoretically shelter something unknown, but a breeding population of creatures this large should leave evidence. There should be bodies, bones, droppings, feeding sites, territory markers. The Owlman leaves none of these. Perhaps it's something even stranger. The concept of interdimensional visitors sounds like science fiction until you consider quantum physics and the growing acceptance that our reality might be just one layer among many. What if certain locations serve as thin places where the boundaries between worlds grow permeable? Mawnan Church sits on land that was sacred long before Christianity arrived, and folklore suggests these ancient sites hold power that rational minds dismiss too quickly. Could the Owlman be a visitor from some adjacent reality, slipping through at certain times, under certain conditions, when the barriers weaken? Then there's the most unsettling theory of all. What if the Owlman is neither animal nor alien, but something generated by human consciousness itself? A manifestation of collective fear, given form and substance by the accumulated dread of generations who've sensed predators in the darkness since our ancestors first descended from trees. Carl Jung wrote about archetypes that live in the collective unconscious, primal images and fears shared across humanity. The demon with wings, the watcher in darkness, the thing that hunts from above while we're vulnerable below. Perhaps Mawnan Church, with its centuries of death and burial, its accumulation of human emotion and spiritual energy, serves as a focal point where these archetypal terrors can briefly take physical form. The pattern suggests intelligence, purpose, cycles. The encounters cluster around specific years, then nothing. Silence for stretches of time, then sudden reappearances. 1976 and 77 saw multiple sightings in rapid succession. Then decades of quiet before 2007 brought new reports. Is there a pattern here? A predictable cycle that might tell us when to expect the next appearance? Some researchers have attempted to chart lunar cycles, tidal patterns, even ley lines and earth energies, searching for the key that might predict when the Owlman will return. So far, the pattern remains frustratingly elusive, if it exists at all. What we're left with is profoundly disturbing in its ambiguity. Mawnan Church still stands exactly where it has for centuries. The woods still surround it, dense and whispering with wind through ancient trees. The tower still rises against the sky, providing the perfect perch for something to watch and wait. Visitors still come, most of them blissfully unaware of the history saturating this ground, the testimonies recorded, the lives altered by brief encounters with something impossible. But awareness changes nothing. Whether you believe in the Owlman or dismiss it as misidentification and hysteria, the location remains. The shadows still deepen as evening approaches. The church tower still looms. And if even one of those witnesses told the truth, if even one encounter was real, then something genuinely impossible has walked these woods and might do so again. It could be watching right now, patient and eternal, waiting for the right conditions to spread those massive wings and remind us that we don't understand our world as completely as we'd like to believe. The truth is that some mysteries resist solution. They exist not to be solved, but to maintain their power over us, to preserve those dark corners where certainty fails and wonder survive. The Owlman of Mawnan Church belongs to that category of enigmas that serve a deeper purpose than mere puzzlement. It reminds us that despite our technology and science, our satellites and databases, there are still phenomena that slip through our understanding. Still encounters that can't be explained away. Still moments when ordinary people glimpse something extraordinary and find their worldview shattered by impossible reality. The woods whisper, the tower watches, and somewhere in the shadows between what we know and what we fear, the Owlman waits. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.